The coffee hit my blouse before the laughter did, and somehow the laughter stung worse. 11 ounces of it, scalding through cotton, and across the analyst floor of Ashworth Vane Maritime Holdings, 3 junior brokers watched me blot at my collar like it was the funniest thing they'd seen all quarter. Petra Doyle had done it on purpose. She always did it on purpose, ever since the rumor went around that my suppressants had failed twice in 1 year and my scent came in wrong at the edges. Sour, she said. Defective, she said, like something you'd send back. My name is Wren Calloway. I was 26 years old. I had $1,100 in my checking account, and I had memorized every clause of Ashworth Vane's Pacific freight contracts because nobody else on the floor would read past page 4. I kept a chipped blue mug on my desk, dented at the rim, the color of a dented sky, because it had been my grandmother's, and because it was the only thing in that building that had ever belonged to someone who loved me. Careful, Petra said, not sorry at all. Wouldn't want you smelling like something's wrong with you. Again, I said nothing. I never said anything. I went back to the manifest spread across my screen, container counts, insurance filings, numbers that didn't argue back, and that was when I saw it. A rounding error that wasn't a rounding error. 41 shipments, over 6 months. Each one insured for 8% more than its manifested weight, each discrepancy small enough to vanish inside a company that moved $11 billion of freight a year. Nobody else would have caught it. I caught it because numbers were the one language that had never once lied to me. I didn't know yet that the woman who owned this building had buried her wife 4 years ago and never once cried where anyone could see her do it. I didn't know that by midnight I would be standing in her office with my hand shaking around a printout, and that the coldest, most feared executive on the Eastern Seaboard would look at me the way no one had looked at me in a decade. Like I was the only person in the room worth looking at. If you want to see where that started, stay through this one. It's worth it. Before the story keeps falling, take 1 second and subscribe to the channel so you don't lose your place in it. The elevator to the executive floor required a keycard I didn't have, so I stood in the lobby for 40 minutes rehearsing sentences that all sounded stupid out loud. There's a pattern in the freight insurance filings. I think someone's been skimming for 6 months. I'm probably wrong. I was not, in fact, wrong. I had checked it 4 times. Priya Okonkwo-Hale found me first, Ashworth Vane's chief of security and operations, a woman built like a closed door who had a reputation for eating junior analysts for breakfast and had never, as far as anyone knew, smiled inside these walls. "You're not cleared for this floor," she said. "I found something in the Pacific freight files. Insurance fraud. I think it's been running 6 months, maybe longer." My voice cracked on months. I need someone to look at it before the quarterly filing goes out tomorrow. Priya studied me the way you'd study a fire alarm that had never once gone off before, not certain whether to trust it, not willing to ignore it either. 15 minutes, she said. "If you're wasting them, you'll never see this floor again." She was not wasting them. 20 minutes later, I stood in a boardroom of glass and cold light, in front of 6 executives and 1 woman at the head of the table who hadn't been introduced to me, who didn't need to be. The press called her the Widow Regent of Ashworth Vane, and the epithet was accurate in every way that mattered, regal, remote, and grieving something she never spoke of. Mira Ashworth Vane. 34 years old. She ran a shipping empire with 4,000 employees and had not, according to the building's rumor mill, taken a single vacation day in 4 years. She smelled like smoked birch and cold rain, the kind of scent that arrived in a room a half-second before she did, and it hit me so hard my hands stopped shaking just to catalog it. "You're the analyst who found the discrepancy," she said. Not a question. Alphas who ran empires did not ask questions they already knew the answers to. Ren Calloway, I said. Junior logistics analyst. I found 41 shipments with inflated insurance valuations, all routed through the same regional broker, all approved by the same signature. I put the printout on the table with a hand that had finally stopped shaking. It's not a rounding error, it's a pattern. Someone built it to look like noise. Silence, then Julian Ashworth Vane, Mira's cousin, VP of Logistics, a man who wore his contempt for omegas the way other men wore cologne, laughed once, short and ugly. A junior analyst caught what 4 senior auditors missed. 4 senior auditors weren't looking, I said. I was. Mira's eyes moved from the printout to my face and stayed there. Something crossed her expression I couldn't name yet, not surprise. Exactly. Recognition. Like she'd been waiting 4 years for someone in this building to actually look at the numbers instead of the room. Pull every filing this broker's touched in the last 18 months, she told Priya without looking away from me. And reassign Miss Calloway to my office. Effective tonight. Ma'am, she's junior staff. She hasn't been vetted for. She just vetted herself, Mira said. Effective tonight. That was the first time I crossed the threshold into her world, and I did it not knowing that inside it was a dead wife, a cousin with a debt to settle, and a porch light on a coastal island that had never once, in 4 years, been allowed to go dark. The executive floor had its own weather. I noticed it the way you'd notice a temperature drop. The carpet went from industrial gray to something the color of low tide. The air smelled like money and cold stone, and every assistant who passed me in the hallway looked at my department badge like it had expired. You'll want the blazer off the rack in the closet, said Deja Marsh, the only other analyst who'd bothered to introduce herself in 3 days. Dee had a laugh like a slammed door, and zero patience for the executive floor's pretensions. That one's from the discount case. She'll notice. She notices everything, I said. It wasn't a guess. In 72 hours, I had watched Mira Ashworth Vane clock a missing decimal point from across a conference table without glancing at the printout twice. She noticed things about me too, though she never said so directly. The second night, working past 10 on the broker files, I looked up to find a paper bag on the corner of my desk, a sandwich, chamomile tea, too much honey. Exactly the way I drank it, which I had mentioned exactly once, in passing, to no one who should have remembered. You skip lunch, Mira said, from the doorway, like it was an accusation. It slows your work by 11% by 4 o'clock. I checked. You timed my typing. I time everyone's typing. A pause. Yours is the only one worth protecting. It wasn't kindness that made her do it. It was recognition. She'd spent 4 years running numbers on everyone in this building, and I was the first one whose numbers told her something true. The wealth gap declared itself everywhere. The elevator that required 3 separate clearances, the boardroom where a single chair cost more than my monthly rent, the way Julian's assistant sneered at my chipped mug sitting on the executive floor's marble counter, like a stray dog had wandered in. But it was the small things that undid me. Mira remembered that I hated overhead fluorescence and had my new desk moved under a window. She remembered I'd mentioned, once, a childhood dream of restoring old lighthouses, and 3 days later, a maritime survey of decommissioned coastal lights sat on my desk with no note attached. You didn't have to do that, I told her. I know, she said. That's why I did it. The first charged touch happened over the broker files, her hand reaching to turn a page the same second mine did, both of us going still when our fingers met. Her scent flooded warmer for exactly 2 seconds, birch and rain gone suddenly close, gone suddenly searching, before she pulled back like she'd touched something live. Sorry, she said, which from a woman who never apologized for anything was its own kind of confession. Don't be. My pulse was doing something humiliating. I didn't mind. She looked at me a beat too long. That's the problem, she said, and left before I could ask what she meant. I found the answer 4 nights later, buried in an insurance filing from 4 years back, the year her wife Alina had died in a car that the official report called a mechanical failure. The tire pressure numbers didn't match the maintenance log. The maintenance log had been signed by the same regional broker, whose name sat at the center of the fraud I'd just uncovered. I didn't sleep that night. I sat with the 2 files open side by side and understood, with the cold, clean certainty numbers had always given me, that someone in this building had killed Mira Ashworth-Vane's wife and was still cashing checks for it. I brought it to her at 7 in the morning, before the floor filled, my hands shaking again for the first time in weeks. I need you to look at this, I said, and I need you to sit down first. She read it standing. She read it twice. When she finally looked up, the coldness that had sat over her like weather for 4 years had cracked clean down the middle, and underneath it was something so raw I had to look away. Say it, she said. Say what you think it means. I think Elena's accident wasn't an accident. I think whoever's been skimming freight insurance for 6 months is the same person who signed off on a maintenance report that let a woman drive on tires that shouldn't have passed inspection. My voice dropped. I think it's someone who had access to both files, someone senior enough that nobody would ever check his signature twice. Mira didn't move for 11 seconds. I counted every one of them. Julian, she said, and the name came out like a verdict already handed down. The board meeting where Julian's name first came under real scrutiny happened on a Thursday, and by Friday afternoon he'd demanded, a company retreat at the family's coastal property on Averill Island, ostensibly to settle the freight matter privately, as a family. Mira agreed. I understood later she'd agreed because refusing would have told him she already knew, and she needed him comfortable enough to make a mistake. What none of us accounted for was the storm. The causeway to Averill Island flooded twice a year on a schedule the tide charts could set their watch by, and this was one of those weeks, a nor'easter stacking up off the coast, forecast to make landfall by evening. Priya wanted to cancel. Julian, oddly insistent, wanted to proceed. Mira, reading something in his insistence I didn't yet understand, agreed to stay through the storm and pulled me along as her analyst of record, the one person whose numbers he couldn't argue with. By 6 that evening, the causeway was underwater, and the house had lost half its power. Julian and 2 of his people took the guest wing. Priya took the security room. That left the main house, 3 habitable rooms, 1 working generator, 1 working fireplace, to Mira and me, and a storm that rattled the windows like something trying to get in. There's 1 guest room with heat, Mira said, not quite meeting my eyes. The rest of the house is going to drop into the 40s tonight. I'll take the couch. You'll freeze on the couch. A pause, clipped and careful. The bed's large enough that we won't have to negotiate territory. I laughed, despite myself. Is that a professional assessment? It's an accurate one. The corner of her mouth moved, almost a smile, gone before it landed. Ask me with your words if you're comfortable with it. I won't be offended either way. I'm comfortable, I said, and meant it more than the sentence let on. We didn't talk about the fraud that night, or Julian, or Elena. We talked about nothing. The lighthouse survey she'd given me, the fact she'd never once been sailing despite owning 11 cargo ships, the ugly floral wallpaper Elena had insisted on in this exact room a decade ago, and Mira had never had the heart to change. Somewhere in the second hour of rain against glass, exhaustion did what 3 days of forced professionalism couldn't, and I fell asleep with my back to the cold half of the mattress and woke sometime past midnight, already moving, already cold, already chasing the one warm thing in the room. I didn't decide to press my face into her neck. My body decided it for me, half asleep and scent-starved, seeking birch and rain the way a compass seeks north. Mira went rigid. Not away, not toward, simply rigid, every muscle locked, her breath catching somewhere it didn't finish, like a woman standing very still so a wild animal wouldn't bolt. Ren, her voice was low, unsteady in a way I had never once heard it. "You're asleep." I said, not actually asleep anymore, but close enough to honesty that I didn't lift my head. "You're warm." Ren, steadier now, but her hand had come up to hover an inch above my shoulder, not touching, not retreating. "If you don't move in the next 10 seconds, I am going to do something we can't undo with an apology in the morning." I lifted my head that time. Her eyes had gone dark in the dim light, pupils blown wide, her scent gone thick and close in a way I felt in my chest before I understood it with my mind. "What if I don't want the apology in the morning version?" I said. "Then say it clearly. Ask me with your words." Her hand still hadn't landed. "Tell me to stop, and I will. Every time. Forever, if that's what you need. I don't want you to stop." Her hand landed then, gentle at my jaw, and she held very still, letting me feel the restraint in it, the sheer effort of a woman who could have taken anything and was instead asking permission for everything. "Say it again," she said. "So I know it's not the storm talking. I don't want you to stop." I put my hand flat over her heart and felt it hammering under my palm, fast as mine. I haven't wanted anyone to stop in longer than I can admit. She kissed me like she'd been rehearsing restraint her whole life and had finally been given permission to put it down. It didn't go further than that. A kiss, her forehead against mine after, both of us breathing like we'd run somewhere. But something in the room had changed permanently, the way a house changes the first night someone leaves a light on in a window that used to stay dark. My grandmother used to say, I told her, into the quiet after, find the ones who leave the porch light on. She meant find the people who wait for you on purpose. Mira was quiet a long moment. I've left every light in this house on since Elena died, she said. Every night. I told myself it was for security. It was never for security. I didn't ask what it was for. I already knew. The storm didn't break until near dawn, and neither did we, not really. We lay in the dark trading pieces of ourselves like people finally allowed to be honest after years of practiced silence. I want to see the scar, I said, when she flinched, pulling her sleeve up to check the time. Not a request. An offering, if she wanted it. She showed me, a line along her forearm, old and pale. Elena's crash. I pulled her out of the car before it went into the water. I was 6 seconds too slow to matter. Her voice didn't shake, which was somehow worse than if it had. My mother taught me that control was the only love that lasted. Emotion gets people killed, she used to say. I believed her for 30 years. Then I watched control fail to save the one person I actually loved, and I didn't know what else to build myself out of. You built yourself out of grief and called it discipline, I said. Yes, she looked at me like I'd handed her something she'd been searching for in the dark. How did you know that? Because I did the same thing with invisibility. I told her then about the suppressant reaction that had scarred my scent glands at 19, about my father calling it a defect where the neighbors could hear, about my mother's silence being worse than his shouting, about leaving nursing school to pay my sister's medical debt and never once regretting the money, only the version of myself it cost. They called me broken because my body didn't run on their schedule. I spent 7 years believing them. You're not broken. Mira's hand found mine under the blanket, thumb moving slow across my knuckles, the the same gesture I would learn she used when she was choosing every word. "You're the only person in that building whose numbers never once lied to me." "That's not defective. That's rare." "Why me?" I asked, the question I'd been carrying since the boardroom. "You could have anyone." "I could have anyone who wanted my money, or my name, or the safety of standing next to it." Her voice dropped, certain in a way that undid me more than the kiss had. "You looked at a printout of fraud that could have ended my company, and you were more worried about telling me gently than about what it would cost you to be right." Nobody's protected my feelings before my interests in 4 years. I don't want anyone. I want the woman who does that. We made chamomile tea in the dark kitchen an hour later, and Mrs. Okafor, the housekeeper who'd run this house since before Elena, found us there at sunrise and said nothing at all, only smiled, set down a second mug beside my chipped blue one that I hadn't even realized I'd brought, and left the room like she'd seen exactly what she'd hoped to see in it. The causeway cleared by noon, and Julian's mood had curdled into something sharp-edged and watchful that I mistook, at the time, for jealousy. It wasn't jealousy. It was fear, dressed up as irritation, and it should have warned me. It didn't. 3 days later, back at headquarters, security escorted me off the executive floor in front of the entire analyst pool, my badge deactivated, a printed accusation in Priya's hand that made my stomach drop clean through the floor, falsified freight records, evidence planted under my login credentials, an anonymous tip that traced the entire 6-month fraud back to me. "I didn't do this," I said, while Petra Doyle watched from her desk with an expression I would remember for the rest of my life. "Priya, you know I didn't do this." "I know what the logs say," Priya said, and her voice had none of its usual steel in it, only something close to apology. "I have to follow the logs until I can prove they're wrong." Julian stood in his office doorway as they walked me out, and for exactly 1 second his mask slipped enough to show me the man underneath it, satisfied, unhurried. A man who had just watched a problem solve itself. "Careful with the variable," he said, quiet enough only I could hear it, using the word he and Petra had both used to mock the irregularity in my scent, in my file, in my worth. Turns out unstable things break exactly when you need them to. I didn't see Mira that day. She was in Geneva for a shipping summit, unreachable, and by the time her plane landed the story had already broken, a press leak, timed with surgical precision, painting the invisible junior analyst as an omega con artist who'd manipulated her way into the CEO's confidence and her company's books. My photo ran beside the headline. My mother's silence rang in my ears louder than the accusation itself. I sat in a holding room at the county courthouse that night, cuffed hands folded in my lap, listening to my own name dissolve into a story someone else had written for me, and I understood, with a clarity colder than any fraud pattern I'd ever traced, that I had never once been safe. I had only been unwatched. Mira's mask came back on somewhere over the Atlantic. I learned that later, secondhand, from Dee, who'd watched her walk off the company jet at midnight with a face like carved stone and order every lawyer on retainer into a conference room before she'd even set down her bag. Publicly, she said nothing. Privately, Priya told me, much later, when it was safe to say it, Mira hadn't slept, hadn't eaten, had stood at the window of her office watching the harbor for 6 straight hours like she was counting every ship that hadn't sunk. I didn't know any of that yet. What I knew was a cell that smelled like bleach and nothing else, a public defender who called me Han like I was already convicted, and a version of myself I hadn't visited in 7 years, the girl standing in her parents' kitchen being told what she was worth by people who'd decided the number before she walked in. That was the worst image of the whole story, and I lived inside it for 2 full days, alone, unscented, unheld, waiting for someone who might not come. They let me make one call on the second morning. I called Dee. God bless her, put the phone on speaker in the middle of the analyst floor loud enough for the whole department to hear her say, "She's being framed, and every single one of you laughing at her 3 weeks ago is going to remember this exactly the way it happens." Which was, I would learn. The first crack in the story Julian had built. The second crack came from me. Sitting in that cell with nothing but time, I did the only thing I had ever been good at. I asked for paper. I rebuilt the fraud pattern from memory. Every shipment, every broker signature, every insurance filing, cross-referenced against the maintenance report from Elena's crash. And I found the one thing that had been staring at all of us the whole time. The falsified login records planted under my name had been generated 4 hours before my badge was deactivated. Timestamped from a terminal on the executive floor that only 3 people had access to. Julian's was one of them. I wrote it all out in a shaking hand and gave it to my lawyer with instructions to get it to exactly one person. Mira arrived at the courthouse 40 minutes later, and I heard her before I saw her, heels on tile like a countdown, a voice cutting through a hallway of security like weather clearing. "Where is she?" she said. And it was not a question. It had never once been a question with her. And 30 seconds after that, the cell door opened, and birch and cold rain flooded a room that had smelled like nothing for 2 days. "I found it," I said, before she could say anything at all. The login timestamp. "It's Julian. It's always been Julian." I know. Her hands framed my face like she was checking I was real. "I've known since Geneva. I needed the proof to be unbreakable, and you just handed it to me." "You could have told me you knew." "I could have," she agreed. I was terrified that if I said his name out loud before I was ready, he'd disappear before I could make him answer for both things. For the fraud, her voice cracked, finally on the word she'd been holding 4 years. And for Elena. We didn't have time to say more than that. Julian, informed his cousin was moving against him, had already left the building with a security detail and a car headed for the private airfield, and Priya's voice came through Mira's phone flat and urgent. He wasn't running from the fraud charge. He was running with 2 of Elena's original case files, the ones that would have proven the maintenance report was falsified, the ones that were the only physical evidence left connecting him to a murder 4 years buried. "He's not getting on that plane," Mira said, and the look on her face was the first time I understood exactly how much restraint had been holding her together for 4 straight years. We reached the airfield 11 minutes before departure. Julian's car was still on the tarmac when Mira's arrived, and what happened next moved fast enough that I only understood the shape of it afterward, piece by piece, like assembling a wreck from its debris field. Julian's security officer paid, we'd learn later, out of the same skimmed insurance funds, put himself between Mira and the case files, and when she pushed past him for the folder in Julian's hand, he swung. I didn't think. I stepped into the space where the blow was headed, some instinct older than sense, and Mira moved faster than I did. Taking the hit meant for me across the shoulder hard enough that I heard the sound of it before I understood what it was. "Mira, I'm fine." She wasn't, not entirely, but she was standing, and her hand had already closed around Julian's wrist with a grip that left no room for negotiation. "Now we're even," she said to me, low, almost gentle, under the chaos. "You took the fall for a fraud I should have caught. I'll take a bruise for you any day of the week." Julian, cornered, dropped whatever composure he had left. She would have found out eventually, he spat, meaning Elena, meaning the maintenance report, meaning 4 years of a lie he'd built his entire career on top of. I did what needed doing. The company was bleeding money before I fixed the numbers, and Elena was going to pull the insurance audit that would have exposed it. I didn't plan for her to die. I planned for her to be slow. Mira's grip tightened, and for one long second I watched something in her face that I recognized. The exact edge Julian had pushed himself over 4 years ago. The place where control gave way to something that would not come back from what it was about to do. Mira, I put my hand flat against her uninjured shoulder. Don't. He's not worth what it costs you to do this here. She stopped. Her breath came out ragged, and the rigid line of her shoulders dropped by degrees, and when Priya's security team arrived 90 seconds later to take Julian into custody, Mira Ashworth Vane was standing exactly where the law needed her to be standing, instead of where 4 years of grief had wanted her to stand. "Take him," she said, and her voice didn't break once. "And get me Elena's files back." The press conference happened 6 days later, in the same glass boardroom where I'd first laid a printout in front of a woman I didn't yet know I'd love. Every executive who'd sneered at my chipped mug sat in that room. Petra Doyle sat in the back row, unable to look at anyone. Mira played the recording herself, Julian's confession, captured on the airfield's security audio, his own voice admitting to insurance fraud and to the falsified report that killed Elena Ashworth Vane. The room went silent in a way I had never heard a room go silent before. "Wren Calloway," Mira said, and turned to look at me in front of every person who had ever called me defective, found what 4 senior auditors and one company culture built on looking away could not. She was arrested, publicly humiliated, and nearly convicted for a crime committed by the man sitting in a holding cell 2 floors below us right now, because it was easier for this company to believe an Omega had lied than to believe a Vane had killed someone. Her eyes didn't leave mine. That ends today. Julian was arrested on formal murder and fraud charges within the hour, his assets frozen, his name struck from every filing that bore it. Petra Doyle was terminated by end of week, her severance conditioned on a formal apology I never asked for and never needed. Afterward, in the empty boardroom, Mira knelt in front of me, not for a proposal, not yet, just to be level with me, her hand finding mine. "I love you," she said plainly, the way she said everything true, not because you solved my company's fraud, or because you found my wife's killer. Because you are the first person in 4 years who made me want to stop being careful. Her thumb moved across my knuckles. "Ask me with your words if you'll let me claim you. I mean it every way that word can mean something. I won't take it if you're not certain." "I'm certain," I said. "I have been certain since a storm in a house full of dark rooms, and one that wasn't." She kissed the mark at my scent gland first, soft, asking permission with her whole body before she asked with her voice one final time. "Tell me to stop, and I will." "Don't stop," I said, and she didn't, and when her teeth found the mark and the bond snapped into place between us, I felt her 4 years of grief and restraint and carefully rationed hope pour into me all at once, warm as a lit window on a cold night, and understood I would spend the rest of my life being someone's home instead of someone's afterthought. She proposed properly 11 days later, on the porch of the coastal house, every light in every window burning behind her, though it was barely dusk. A small box in her hand that held her grandmother's ring instead of anything bought new. "I don't have a speech," she said, kneeling on old wooden boards Alana had once loved and she had never stopped protecting. "I have a house full of lights I've kept on for 4 years, waiting for someone worth leaving them on for. Marry me, Wren. Let the porch light mean something again." "Yes," I said, before she'd even finished, and Mrs. Okafor, watching from the kitchen window with tears she didn't bother hiding, said the line that certified everything the whole staff had watched happen in that house. In 11 years, I have never once seen her wait for anyone. She's been waiting for you since before you walked in the door. We married in that same boardroom, ironically, 6 months later. Glass walls turned gold with late afternoon light, Dee as my witness. Priya standing beside Mira with a look on her face I'd never once seen from her. Something unguarded, something proud. The vows were short. Mira's hand didn't shake once. "I will always leave the light on," she said. That's not a metaphor anymore. That's a promise I intend to keep every night for the rest of my life. A year on, Julian sat in a federal facility awaiting sentencing on charges that would keep him there for the remainder of his natural life. Petra Doyle worked retail 2 towns over and had, according to Dee, developed a sudden and total commitment to never mentioning omegas again. My mother sent one letter, which I read once and did not answer. Some doors, once closed properly, deserve to stay closed. Ashworth Vane Maritime instituted a whistleblower fund in Elena's name, and its first grant went to a young analyst, no older than I'd been, who'd caught a discrepancy nobody else was willing to look at twice. On the anniversary of the storm, Mira found me on the porch with my grandmother's chipped mug, refilled now with chamomile tea, too much honey, exactly the way I liked it, and she wrapped a blanket around both our shoulders against the first cold snap of autumn. "My favorite variable," she said into my hair. The old insult, worn soft as driftwood, meant now the way only she could mean it, as the truest compliment she owned. I pressed my face into her neck on purpose this time, and her whole body went warm instead of rigid, the way it always did now, the way it would for the rest of both our lives. It wasn't beauty that saved either of us, in the end. It was the plain, stubborn insistence of being seen for exactly what we were and choosing to stay anyway. Some people spend their whole lives waiting for someone to leave the light on for them. The lucky ones learn, eventually, that they were allowed to leave it on for themselves the whole time, and luckier still, the ones who find someone willing to keep it burning beside them. The end. If this story found something true in you, that quiet ache of being overlooked until the right person finally sees you completely, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists to tell. Subscribing means you won't miss the next one. I'd love to know in the comments, what's the moment you'd point to as the instant Mira truly saw Ren for who she was? The storm night, the boardroom rescue, or somewhere else entirely? Drop your answer below. Until next time, keep the light on for yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.